So I'm Sarah King, and I am the Executive Director of the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance, as well as being a rancher down here in Arizona. And this is just kind of a use your children at work day, showcase of us on the ranch and in action. And then for those of you who aren't familiar with where the Altar Valley is, we are southwest of Tucson, Arizona, and we go right down to the Mexico border. And then where that red star is, that's our ranch on the north end of the valley. And in the Altar Valley, we've got the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance, which, following up from the presentation that we just saw, is a collaborative conservation organization that was founded by the ranchers in the Altar Valley back in 1995. And it was based on the idea of coming together across the 600,000 acre watershed and thinking about projects that could go in on the ground and really be cross-boundary, both literally in fence lines as well as cross-boundary in ownerships, and thinking about what's best for the landscape and how to get that done across the landscape. A couple of the issues that the Alliance was founded over were the Altar Wash, which runs north-south through the valley and is an entrenched area that is lowering the water table and has been a big issue for many generations. And then also brush management, and in particular, fire and prescribed fire on the landscape and what that looks like. Today, our areas of operation focus on community outreach, science, conservation, and our general operations of the organization itself. And we are run by a board that's comprised of landowners throughout the valley, and then also 3 community representatives. And we also have a science advisory board that's from various different agencies, and also the University of Arizona, which is in Tucson, has a lot of participants on that as well. And that's a board that advises our board, our board of directors. And we also have 4 staff members currently, and that's myself and Julia Sigtig Guglielmo, who you guys may have met at various things. And then Mary Miller is working on transitioning back into being a board member from her role on staff. And we've got a new gal who's come in, her name's Kayla. So we are all various combinations of part-time and quarter-time and overlaps, then in the rest of our time with other organizations, ranching or collaborative facilitation organizations and that type of thing. So part of what the Alliance, and then we work with various partners throughout the Altar Valley, county, state, federal, NGOs, University of Arizona, anybody who's got interest in the valley is welcome to come to our meetings and help develop plans and projects that we work on as well. So part of what we've worked on over the years, as I mentioned, the Alliance got started as with some interest in looking at prescribed fire and in general fire on the landscape. And in the 1980s, my in-laws were particularly into implementing fire, and various other folks around the valley were looking at that as a method of mesquite control. And then in the early 1990s, some of the Endangered Species Act compliance kind of brought that to a halt, and various, basically to sum things up, there's an old family photo of my brother-in-law at maybe age 9 on the edge of a fire, lighting the drip torch and helping to do that black lining the night before. So that kind of gives you an idea of where fire and liability was in the 1980s, and then that shift into the 1990s and 2000s. Especially after this fire season, and you folks from New Mexico are well aware that kind of the whole climate has changed. And so the Alliance has spent a lot of time working on that dynamic in various pieces and parts. And so in the late 2000s, around 2008 or 10, I believe, the Alliance got a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant that was designed to write 5 different burn plans. And then there was a second grant that was designed to implement those, along with 2 more. So then in the early 2010s and just beyond that, we were working on getting those on the landscape, and a lot of the things that we thought we had in place, someone to take on the liability from the outset, didn't materialize, kind of changes in organizations, changes in climate, both literally and sort of figuratively collective. Anyhow, so we had a lot of questions, and we were working on trying to bring partners together and figure out how to answer some of those questions. And what we found that having twice yearly fire meetings has really been a game changer for our organization. We have one that's usually in March before the fire season, and then a follow-up one that's in early December to kind of wrap up wildfire season and then think about plans for the winter and going into spring. So they're designed to be twofold. One is that focus on prescribed fire and can we get those executed and out on the landscape, and working on some of those burn plans. And then the other focus is obviously wildfire season and what that's looked like, and how that's gone on the ground. As I'm sure many of you who probably experienced fire either on the firefighting end of things or as a landowner or any combination of things, it can be kind of wild in the mix. And so there's camps that go up in the wrong place, et cetera, et cetera. And these meetings are really designed to bring people together, both landowner wise, fire wise, have those conversations, get to know each other and get to know each other in situations that aren't quite as hot as prescribed fire can be. So where we've seen that pay off recently is the Contreras fire, which you guys might have heard on the news back in June of this year. It made national news because you can see on the fire map there on the left, you can see Kitt Peak there, and Kitt Peak National Observatory is a pretty important, well-known observatory. I suppose mainly if you're in the right circles for observatories, but it did make the New York Times as kind of the fire of that week with a lot of resources on it. The fire started, you can see on the south end at that point in that briefing that's in the middle of the screen there, the black line on the left side, that's basically our ranch there. And then things were still pretty uncontained. And in that first week, the fire did go up and burn over the top of Kitt Peak. And so, as I said, it very much affected us, and you can see we were a little dirty, a little smoke filled, watching the mountains go up in flames. Joe and I that's my husband, spent a couple days moving cows, including at one point moving the entire cow herd after we'd moved them from the pastures where there was fire, and to another 2 pastures because they were going to backburn from a road in the pastures that we just put them in. So that all sounds like a lot of chaos, and you might say, how does your meetings and how does all the preparation kind of work into having positive outcomes on the ground? This fire was really different for our neighborhood, and it affected some of our neighbors as well over boundary lines. There were a lot of folks who came in, and part of what's come out of our fire meetings is this essentially a spreadsheet that then has the map tied to it. It's got contact information, both for landowners as well as agency folks. And the fire team that came in on this, the first team that came in was a local team from Arizona, and they knew about this, and we've gotten it into some of the dispatch corners and stuff. And they really hit the ground running with using information that we've spent all these years building and the relationships that we've spent all these years building. And they got that into the right hands of the right communications folks, did the outreach to landowners early in things. We were looped into the fire teams were looped into each other. By the end, we had a lot of commentary from folks about, what was different about our neighborhood, essentially. And we do think of the Valley as a neighborhood, even though it's a little bigger than the average neighborhood. But they were marked a lot, that there were neighbors who were working together, even in kind of heat of the moment, exchanging trailers and employees to help ride and gather, and just, a lot of things that made a huge difference. And the communication that was in place between the fire team and the landowners, and having those landowners show up to the fire briefings, knowing who to call, knowing how to do outreach. And I mean, obviously there were plenty of hiccups, but really it was a lot of proof in the pudding of what 10 years of work can do in terms of relationship building. And then in thinking about, that's our little corner of the world, but in looking outward and thinking about the rest of all these collaboratives and things, I think that's really a testament to how face-to-face communications matter. And I include Zoom and that kind of stuff in, but what that networking means, having people know each other, having people put foundations in place, kind of like Joe was saying, don't assume that you know what's going on in all circumstances. There's a lot of people working on a lot of different things, and getting all that information out there and shared and networked is hugely important. And I would really encourage any collaboratives to be doing, maybe it's with fire, or maybe it's with another topic that you're passionate about, but to be doing all those kind of things. Everybody, there can be kind of that another meeting type deal, but they really are important, and it really is important to engage with one another. And that's where solutions happen, and that's where stuff gets in place for when there's a crisis and when there's opportunities too. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions, and I'm also happy to share my question time with Joe and Alan too.